Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Jonah and the Pod. Today, we have a very special guest. And this guest, I would say, we've had a few conversations, but not too many, I don't think any one-on-ones, really.
Yeah.
I'm always in group settings.
Yeah.
And the way that we know each other is very interesting as well. Because you are Ralph's cousin.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, I think the way that we sort of met was through a friend group.
Yeah,
it's
that's
completely
right.
separate from Ralph.
That's right.
So everyone, please welcome. I was going to say Lebo Joel. Please welcome Joel. In our friend group, he's called Lebo Joel. There's two Joels.
Thank you very much.
Welcome, Joel.
Thank you.
I would just get you maybe to just introduce yourself. What do you do? Maybe how you became a believer. Just a short run through.
Yeah, sure.
Whatever.
All right. Well, so I'm Joel. The superior Joel out of the Joels. What do? I studied engineering, and I was actually studying structural design engineering, the guys that do calculations for bridges or whatever it is. And then I shifted actually into construction after my studies finished. So I'm doing something totally different to my studies, still engineering, but more in construction phase. So now I'm working alongside Sydney Water, and we just do mechanical and civil engineering with them. So that's my profession. How I became a believer, that's probably more important, is I'm not going to give you the long version, and maybe we can do that for another time, but I'll try to put it in a nutshell. It is a bit of there's a lot of strings and a lot of things to it. But in a nutshell, I grew up with my mum and dad. They split when we were young. My father upheld very strong sort of faith in the house. And my mum also attempted something like that as well. Now, obviously, that's kind of waned off over time, and so my mom's side of the family is kind of like the opposite of my dad's side of the family. That's kind of how my sister and I have seen it as we've aged. They're both great parents, love my mum and my dad to death, but as we look at my mum's side of the family and my dad's side of the family, they're just completely opposite. So I had the faith stronghold to my dad's side of the family, and I had virtually the opposite, my mum's side of the family. And I had a great friend that I grew up with, actually since I was born, quite literally. He's 4 years older than me, so he's always kind of introducing me to the new things as a young kid, and sometimes that can be damaging, but in any case, that was a great best friend of mine. His name was Daniel. And as we aged together, his whole family was very, very, very strong atheists. Not like, oh, I just don't go there, or I'm not sure, or anything like that. It's like, there is no God, and I'm going to do anything and everything I can to kind of preach that there is no God in whatever means possible. And he was really tuned into your Richard Dawkins, and he read all, he was very well read, very well spoken. He actually, his whole world was English. He's now kind of moved in from journalism to a whole series of different things in his life. And I'm not going to go too deep into his life, but you just get the idea. He was very, very well spoken, and how extreme his views kind of were. So to make a long story shorter, as we grew up all the way through until I was 15 years old, we never really spoke about God. He would make these little jests and jokes and stabs and whatever else, and I'd kind of scoff it off. And I had my dad there in the background as that sort of man of faith that I looked up to. And I always saw the contrast in the family, but I never really made any sort of decisions of myself. I would kind of tag along at church because they were divorced. I never really joined my dad, surprisingly, actually, now that I think about it, much at church. My mom tried to get us in and out of church, and I was kind of just tagging along because you get a free hot chocolate when you go to church as a kid back then with the church that we used to attend, and I never really cared for it. So, but one day he actually, even though it was in the back of my mind, God and creation and whatever else, and that's things that my dad used to teach us growing up, he just hit me with, just out of the blue, when I was shy of turning 16, a whole bunch of, how on earth can you believe in the Bible and God, and how can you believe in this? And he started my friend Daniel, he just rained down all these things about the faith pretty much. And I was clueless. I had no idea. He would even say, now that I look back on it, it was so ridiculous. If I had any ounce of knowledge of anything to do with what he said, it would be so easy to refute what he said because it was so uninformed. So in hindsight, I'm like, man, I wish I actually did read my Bible, and I wish I actually knew what I was talking about. But he just completely demolished anything and everything I had to do with the faith. And he used things like the old biblical stories and the typical Richard Dawkins. That was the Enlightenment era, by the way. So that's when he must have, he was really well entrenched in that sort of world. So pretty much from that, I was like, he's got a great point. He's got several great points. I got no refutation. No refute to any of those things. So I think he's right, and I think there is no God. And so I remember calling my dad. I was at my mom's house at the time. I used to jump between them, one half at one house, the other half at the other house, one half of the week at one house. Yeah. And I called my dad, and I said, "Dad, I don't think I believe in God anymore." And he was obviously pretty upset about that. And I said that, look, I'm sorry, I've had a chat with Daniel, and I've been thinking about a lot of things, and I just don't think I believe in God anymore. Like, I think I'm just going to live my life in that sort of way. And then he tried to kind of persuade me otherwise, and that kind of became a bit of a blur, and we ended up hanging up. And then I had a couple of weeks where I was really kind of downtrodden and distraught. I was kind of like, wow, my family have been wasting their time at church. Like, why are they going to church? There's no God. Like, and they all believe that these different things, and it's all fairy tale. And that's how I used to really, like, I used to drive that home on a daily basis, and that was tough. So eventually after maybe a month or two of just kind of that, if you can imagine, every day, every night, you're constantly thinking about these things like, holy cow, everything's like, it's all a waste. My dad's been wasting his life away. All this, like, I used to think like that. I was like, man, I can't believe it. And then I was trying to kind of, okay, now what sort of thing. And I was kind of spiraling downwards as those thoughts were creeping into my mind, until finally and eventually I was getting pretty down. I was pretty upset. I was like, okay, all I want to know is the truth. If there is no God and I can live my life however I want, and that's the truth, then I will live that way. If there is a God, I want to know that there is a God, and I want to be sure in that. I want to have that sure foundation. So as that kind of became my new thought pattern, and to the point where at one night I just broke down, and I was bawling my eyes, and I prayed. I had this crappy little I think it was like a message Bible, or, there's like living translations or whatever else, that little New Testament sort of thing that was sitting there from one time my mum tried to take us to Hillsong. And so I was crying out to God. I closed my door, I knelt down, I lifted my eyes, crying, saying, God, like, if you're out there, just say something to me. Like, speak to me, show me that you exist. If you don't exist, so be it. But if you exist, I want to know. Like, I want to know the truth. I want to know if you're out there. And then I kind of opened my eyes, looked to the side, saw my little crappy New Testament. It was like just one of those little shoddy ones. Yeah. And I grabbed it, and I opened up to literally just grabbed it and opened it up to whatever was there. And I just put my finger on it like this, and I started to read. And it was from Romans. I mean, I can read it to you if you like what I read. Let me just open it up real quick. I'll get it up. Yeah, sure.
Got this big boy.
So it was, I'm just gonna
Romans.
So it was Romans chapter 16.
Romans 16.
Sorry. It was where did it go?
Would you say this is now your favorite verse?
It is for that sentimental reason.
Yeah.
So I'm just changing my version real quick.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm trying to think what in Romans 16. I'm just looking.
Yeah, it's I think it was. Gosh, where is it
now? Let's have a guess.
No, I think I've mixed it. I think I've actually mixed it. Yeah, no, it's I was just talking to someone else about this. Or is it 18?
Romans has 16 chapters.
In my signs, wonders, powerful spirit. No, it's not. It's not.
Do you remember what it says?
Yeah. Oh, there it is. Sorry.
Okay, good.
Gosh, but it is Romans 16. I was like, I'm skimming through. I usually mark it, but what I've done is, this doesn't really matter, but what I've done is I've changed the background of my Bible to black, and I've highlighted it in black. And so I couldn't find the highlight. I'm just kind of skimming through back and forth. But it is Romans 18. Romans 16 verse 18.
Oh, verse 18. Okay.
So it says, for those who are such do not serve the Lord. Actually, let's go from 17. It says, now I urge you, brethren, note those who cause divisions and offenses contrary to the doctrine which you learned, and avoid them. For those who are such do not serve our Lord Jesus Christ, but their own belly, and by smooth words and flattering speech deceive the hearts of the simple. For your obedience has become known to all. Therefore I am glad on your behalf. But I want you to be wise in what is good and simple concerning evil, and the God of peace will crush Satan under your feet shortly.
Yeah, wow.
So if you imagine, sorry, that took a long time to to find that verse,
Okay.
but you can imagine I'm there, I'm bawling my eyes, I cry out to God, I look over, for whatever reason I'm inclined that way, I grab the book, I open it up, I put my finger on it, I read that verse, and I started crying in a different sort of way.
Yeah.
So that's when I kind of first, I was like, all right, if there is a way to be spoken to, that is a way to be spoken to. Now, I also felt an enormous peace rush over me, and that's when I started to really talk to God again. That's when that wasn't like, okay, that's it, perfect, I'm an awesome Christian now. It was like, this is the beginning of change. And that's when I started to do an epic sort of deep dive into life and the faith and God and stuff like that. So that's what got me burning for God in that moment, trying to find out the truth. And that was the beginning of my journey of discovering truth in God and stuff like that. So I started to read into Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, you name it. I was doing just deep dives and reading the Quran, reading the Bible, that sort of stuff. It was a very weird sort of phase. It lasted about 4 years until I was into my 20s. And then I had an assurity in my faith that I was burning for Christ, and it was really good. It was really
Honestly,
nice.
that'll probably give you it'll prepare you for anything now. Like all conversations now with Muslims or whoever, now you're equipped. You're equipped for it all.
It became like a little fun thing to do at uni. Actually, it was just discussing stuff with Muslims and
that's cool.
other believers and stuff like that. And I had a whole string of theology that I kind of dived into as well. And at the beginning, I was kind of just trying to find the truth. But once I did that deep dive, I was like, holy cow, Christianity is so well found. Like it's the foundations of the faith. If something is true, it's going to be proven to be true. You know what I mean? Like it will be true in whatever dive you make, whether you dive in the realm of science, philosophy, history, archaeology, whatever realm you dive into, if something is true, it's going to hold fast and it's going to stand the test of time. And that was something that was very moving as a young lad.
So I was never actually fully like into that stuff until probably recently, where now I'm just learning about like all the evidence of Christianity, and like I've been watching a lot of like Muslim Christian debates, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, the Bible is so like historical. Like it's actually like what's the word? I don't even know what the word is.
Well established?
Yeah, well established, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's literally history.
Yeah.
So it's crazy. Like it's refuted.
Yeah. No, that's right. And like for me, I fell in love with the Lord because of my experience of God, right?
Yeah,
what I experienced that day and throughout the next year or so, and it pushed in through 4 years of study and everything like that afterwards. But that first year and that moment when I encountered God, that's why I love the Lord. It's got nothing to do. What I studied afterwards was just like a stone upon a stone upon a stone on a real firm foundation. Like the way that I've heard it said, and I really love this sort of phrasing, is the sort of studies that you just described, that will tell you how you can believe, but it doesn't tell you why you believe. It's not. I don't believe because of these things that we study and we get interested in. Yeah. I believe because of my encounter with God. But it can tell you how you can believe. And if someone is, how can you possibly believe X, Y, Z? You can, sure. And you need to be ready. What does the word say? It says that you need to be ready to answer when someone asks. And so, yeah, so I do think it can be powerful
for sure.
to have that.
So that was a very good overview of your, I guess, testimony. But I remember you sent me a message and you were saying like, you're preparing for a sermon or something like that.
Oh yeah.
I didn't know this about you, but what are you doing now? Do you just write sermons for fun, or do you actually preach? Or
kind of actually, I'm not like I'm not a regular someone who's sharing regularly at church, you put it that way. The church that I'm attending currently is a very sort of open church in the sense that it gives, as long as they have levels of confidence in the person's faith and maturity in the faith, then they'll open the floor in what they would describe as, as the Spirit leads, sort of thing. And it's freeing, and it can have its risks, and there's all sorts of things to it. And we don't need to go into those sort of topics. Like for me, I don't hold so fast to the belief of the church. But the good thing about that is it's really taught me to, especially with the big topics, like I was saying to you before we started recording, I really enjoy with the big topics to write down stuff. And I found that very, very powerful and helpful to kind of strengthen those deep topics like suffering. Like this is by far the biggest topic. The Trinity, the doctrine of salvation, the philosophy of science, whatever it might be, whatever it is that you're interested in. If it's a big enough topic and it's spoken about enough, you should take it seriously. Yeah. And when it is something like that speaks to me, I start jotting things down. And so what I've done with suffering, we've been speaking about it in the church for a while now, and I keep saying, like, I'd love to have some sort of message or something shared about the topic of suffering because of how common it is. It's something that unbelievers love to hide behind because it kind of gives the image of like intellect, right? It's like, I don't believe because that's logically incompatible, and it's just an easiest sort of wall to build up, and you just hide behind that wall, and it's a great place to be if you can rationalize in that sort of logical way. And as believers, they're often stumbled by this. They say, how could God, this happened in my life, how could God allow that to happen? And it can bring a Christian down. So as I was conversing over the many, many years with the many people I have about these sort of topics, that seems to be the most prominent. Yeah, the most problematic sort of topic that's been coming up. So I've taken that very, very seriously. And so I've written down over the years, 13 or 14 points on the topic of suffering. So if you want, we can.
Oh, that was a fantastic segue. Yeah. You've done my job for me. So that's fantastic. So today we will go through that. Like you said before, you have pointers on this, so it'll be interesting for me to hear, and whoever it is to hear. I think we can go into it. We can just get straight in.
Yeah. Okay.
So is the question, why does God let suffering?
More or less, yeah. It's like it comes in a variety of ways. Oftentimes, as believers, it often just comes up as a very specific instance that occurs in their life, and they go, okay, now tell me why. Like, how could God do that? My child got sick, my dad died, whatever it might be, some horrible, because everyone suffers, right? Everyone knows about suffering, and that's why it's so profound, the question. And that's how I can come across. Other times it's like you might ask someone, okay, why don't you believe in God? And then they just put up that really convenient wall. Well, I mean, if God is, it's usually worded like this, is the cleanest way to word it if you want to get a nice phrasing. If God is all powerful and if God is all good, right? Omnipotent and omnibenevolent. If he's all powerful and all good, why is there suffering in the world? That's kind of the cleanest way that people kind of throw it out and go, bang, there you go. There's my wall and I'm good, you know? And so the reason why I like breaking down these walls is it's almost like you're blasting a light in a space that's infested with roaches, you know? And they're just, you break down that wall, you blast that light on that darkness that they like to hide behind. It's so convenient for them. And what's the first thing they typically do is run for the closest, darkest spot they can find. Yeah. So it's good because it's confronting, right? Like you have to, there is no actual logical incompatibility with that at all. And then you can start doing a bit of diving with them. And it's a very confronting thing to have, and it gets people thinking. So it's good.
Yeah, that's mad. So I think as you speak, I might just play devil's advocate a lot.
Yeah, awesome.
I don't know if I would have questions, but if I do, then
awesome.
Let's get to it.
All right. So for everyone, I don't know if for those who can't see any recording, I've just got some notes here, and this just helps me keep my train of thought for those 13, 14 points that I mentioned before. This is just how I like to run. It also helps me quote people more accurately as well when I do go through that sort of process. So, we spoke about the whole topic itself and how it's kind of phrased and things of that sort of nature. And it can be very, very, it can really shake you, if whether you're a believer or unbeliever. And I've personally been wrestling with this for quite some time. Now, we probably won't get through all 14. To be honest with you, I'm being completely sincere about this, you could quite literally spend an entire podcast day or even a week on some of these points.
Yeah.
Like, there's a great sermon that actually Joel sent me, the inferior Joel.
Inferior.
The inferior Joel. Inferior Joel. He sent me a sermon on this topic, and the entire sermon was just talking about God's glory. And it's awesome. That's beautiful. And that's like one of many, many aspects of addressing this question. So I'm just going to like breeze through, and you just have a crack at whatever you want to have a crack at. You can do it that way if you want. So I found the most helpful thing to start with is actually a point that William Lane Craig makes. Anyone that knows me knows I love William Lane Craig. He's my favorite philosopher, and he does a great job at attacking this. And his kind of first approach at this question, whenever it's raised to him, what do you do with a God who's meant to be all powerful and all good, and there's evil and suffering in the world? The first question he asks, and it's become my first question, is, do you have an intellectual problem with this, or is it an emotional problem with this? And that's, to me, like the perfect place to start, because you want to know where that person stands, right?
For sure, that's a good one.
And so that's where he usually starts. He'll say, for example, you'll hear people kind of disguising behind that question. But when you start doing a little bit of digging, I think you'll end up finding that it's a lot less of an intellectual problem, and it really usually surfaces as an emotional problem. Like we have to be honest with ourselves, and that does take a lot of self-reflection and deep diving on our own part. But I think when you really dig deep and you really try to probe, and not only this is for myself, so I can speak for myself first, but everyone that I've spoken to, when you really start to do some digging, it really becomes just an emotional problem. So I'll have a crack at the intellectual side of things, and this is each of my points. There's about, like I said, 13 to 14 points, and each of them are kind of based on different things. One of them might be based on philosophy, one of them might be based on science, one of them might be based on theology, and they all kind of vary in that regard. This one's more like a philosophical point. So
is it like, let's say I said intellectual, this would be your answer?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. And so if the point is, it's intellectual, it's incompatible for there to be a God that exists and suffering in this world. For me, I think it's quite easy to tackle the intellectual problem. And not only just in my opinion, when you go into the realm of philosophy of religion and they do these discussions and writings, usually the intellectual problem is done away with quite easily. So when you go through the intellectual problem, you have to ask yourself, is the atheist claiming, like the many atheist philosophers, like Bertrand Russell and all those sort of guys, this is often their a claim that they like to make, that the existence of God is logically incompatible with suffering in this world. But when you think about those two things, they're not logically incompatible in and of themselves. There's got to be some sort of hidden assumption, right? There's got to be some presupposition that they're making, that they're interjecting into those two things, God and suffering, that makes it incompatible, right? So, and that's what you got to kind of dig out of them. So you'll actually be able to find that as long as the statement is true, like because you can slide in a third piece into this, right? You have God and you have suffering. As soon as you inject that God has morally sufficient reasons for suffering, all of a sudden that whole thing falls apart. And for someone to try to hold intellectually that there can't possibly be a God who has morally sufficient reasons for the suffering in this world, it just becomes a complete debacle. And that's not to just find like an intellectual way out of this question. It's a genuine thing that you need to raise. And I think as we go deeper, you'll be able to find that. So the atheist has to try to find how it's logically impossible for God to have morally sufficient reasons for permitting evil and suffering in the world. And so the logical version starts to become like, okay, well, it's not logically impossible for God to have morally sufficient reasons for the suffering in this world, but it's improbable. And it becomes kind of like a probabilistic argument. It can sometimes sort of shift in that sort of way.
So it's sort of lessened from impossible to improbable.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly right. They kind of like, well, there shouldn't be a world like this if God is, and it starts to become like that sort of probabilistic argument. And they'll try to say, pretty much trying to hinge on that probabilistic argument. But how could the atheist or anyone possibly know that? You know what I mean? So how could the atheist possibly know that God would not, if he existed, permit evil and suffering in this world, and maybe he's got good reasons for it. So in Christian theism, God's purpose for human history is to bring people into a loving relationship with him and for his glory. That's what we know life to be about, right? And so how do we know that, actually in 2 Peter chapter 3, it says that God is long suffering toward us, not willing that any should perish, but all should come to repentance. How would we know that it would not require a world that's simply suffused with suffering for those sort of things to come about, for the salvation of the many and for the glory of God? How do we know that has no part to play in the suffering that exists in the world? And it might be that it's only in a world like that you'll get the maximum people coming to the salvation of to come to know the Lord in a free, loving relationship. And so the atheist would have to kind of show that it's possible that there's a possible world that's feasible for God, that God could have created, and that salvation, eternal life, would be able to come about in a world with no suffering at all. So
can you say that?
Sure. So it pretty much the atheist would have to show that there is a possible world that is feasible for God, which God could have created, that would have just as much salvation and eternal life as the actual world.
Yeah.
But with less suffering. That's kind of what the atheist has to do now. And how could an atheist possibly prove something like that as well? You can see that it all just becomes conjecture, and it becomes like, no, God could have created a world with free agents and just as much salvation and glory to God, but with less suffering. And that's kind of what they have to. That's what they hinge on. That's what they hinge to. So,
but then you try and sort of like, explain that to me. Like, how is that possible, sort of thing?
Well, yeah, like if you just try to get how can you possibly show an example of a world as a human being where people are perfectly free and are coming to the Lord in the way that we are in this world, but with their suffering? It starts to go into another topic of free will and the universe and all that sort of stuff. But you can see what it started off as. If there is a God, there should be no evil, and it's either God is not all powerful and all good, blah, blah, blah. And then it kind of turns into like a probabilistic argument about, then there should be less suffering, or God, like they start to move towards that sort of avenue because it's not incompatible. We know that, and we know that there's good reason for everything that happens. And look, I totally get that the philosophical approach is not satisfying, and it's definitely not exhaustive on the question. Yeah. But you got to see that as you kind of walk down these roads of the incompatibility of God and the logical incompatibility of God and suffering, that it just starts to fall apart, because it becomes like this. Here you are as a human being saying that you could have created a world where people are completely free in exactly the same way, and it has just as much salvation and brings just as much glory to God, but with less suffering. And then that's where it starts to fall apart, just logically, just purely intellectually. But it's not satisfying from an emotional perspective, because then you'll start saying, what will inevitably start happening is they just start bringing up emotional things. Well, then this child died. Like, what's the go with that? Why did this tree fell down and killed this animal or this person or whatever it might be, And then that's when you start to see, and it starts to surface that, okay, well, this is not actually an intellectual problem. It's not a logical incompatibility issue. This is an emotional problem, whereas I just don't want to believe in a God that would allow this sort of suffering.
Can I ask, would you interchange the word suffering and discipline, or no?
Interchange suffering and discipline. I think there's a relationship between the two, but I wouldn't interchange them. Okay. I think that with discipline comes suffering. And with suffering comes discipline in that way. They have a great relationship in that regard. But I wouldn't conflate the two things, because even though one produces the other, they're totally different things. People can suffer and unfortunately not be disciplined. Yeah, and that's a problem of the heart and the mind. Yeah. But yeah, I think I can see the relationship between
the two. Because the last point that you were making of like they need to find a world where God allows free will but no suffering. It sounds like, in my head, the first image that came is like a parent that has kids that shows no discipline, no punishment, none of that. And those kids are usually,
okay.
you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
those
I see
kids
what
are
you're
usually going to just be rebellious, not have any like discipline, not do well in life, that kind of thing. That's the correlation I made in my mind. So I wasn't sure if that was
No, that's actually a good point. So you're touching on one aspect of suffering, which is discipline, right?
Yeah.
And that is a form of suffering.
Yeah.
And that's So I see where you're coming from. You're angling it like when discipline is brought directly by God, kind of like the chastising of the children, as the Bible puts it. Then that is direct suffering from the parent.
Yeah.
In order to shape us, and it lists those things, those characteristics that it develops in us in the Bible.
But that probably wouldn't sit well with then why are people suffering in Africa, that kind of thing.
It's like my dad has cancer.
Yeah.
It's like, well, what do you do with that? You know?
Yeah.
And obviously we can dive deeper into all those things, but that's the sort of thing people will just bring up an example like that. And as soon as they do, you know that it's an emotional problem, and rightfully so, right? It's a tough question to try and struggle with. But at least you can know that this is not a logical incompatibility. This is not actually, there's nothing logically incoherent when you say that there is a God who is all powerful and all good, who has morally sufficient reasons for everything that happens in the world. And we, with our pathetic 3-pound brains, don't know what tomorrow brings. Yeah. And for us to try and proclaim that it's incompatible for God to exist with suffering, I think that's where you gotta. I'm sorry, but it's not an intellectual problem, and it's fine to be an emotional problem, but you gotta at least nail that down and say and be able to bring that home.
I sort of think it's more admirable if it is an emotional problem, because intellectually, like, maybe people don't really understand this, but for me, if I look at it as an intellectual problem, then it's like I'm sort of playing God in that aspect, when realistically, if God is all knowing and all powerful, all this stuff, he knows far greater than I do. So there's a reason for suffering. So then I think it would have to be an emotional problem, because then I'm trying to compare my intellect to God's intellect.
Yeah.
Which is,
there's just no way of knowing, right? There is no possible way you can make that claim with any level of confidence.
Yeah.
And that's where the intellectual problem falls apart. That's why, like, for me, we're speaking as laymen, right? I'm an engineer. You're working in IT. We're not philosophers and everything else. But when you do the deep dive into into philosophy, and you read up on what you can read up on, and you see where what it ends up coming down to, it usually falls apart at the logical seam, right? Yeah. So that's why for me it's quite easy to see when you dive deep enough that it just becomes an emotional problem.
Yeah, for sure.
So with respect to the emotional issue, that's much more difficult to deal with, because now we're talking about ministry almost, right? Like as a minister or a pastor or whatever it is that you can look up to in a church, that becomes their job to battle with the theology and the intricacies of a person's individual experiences. Like, it's really hard to deal with. But for me, I just like to think of, what does Christianity have to say about it?
Can I ask a question before we get into
that? Of course.
Because I was just thinking about it. Because I'm actually not too versed in these conversations. Maybe it is something I should learn. But you know how they always argue, like, if there is a God, why is suffering a thing? What is their reason for suffering if they believe in no God? If that makes sense. Yeah,
that's actually one of the points I've written down is exactly that, right? It's what's the alternative, right? Like,
we'll get into that.
So yeah, like the first point that I've got here is an emotional intellectual problem. I think it's like point number 8 or something like that, or whatever, and down is literally exactly what you just said. It's like, well, what's the alternative? Like, you bring up the problem as though it's solved, but what you actually have to offer in response to it is something in the opposite direction. It's hopelessness. It's, you know what I mean? So like,
is it like everyone has their own moral compass sort of thing?
Yeah, and it becomes like a moral relativism where they start to dive into a world of meaninglessness and aimlessness, right? And everything just becomes opinion and unavoidably self-centered. Like, even though they can say they want to live their life with their own individual view of meaning, really, ultimately, it's completely relative, and it just becomes.
That's why what is the meaning of life is such a prominent question amongst these circles. But for us, it's pretty easy to.
Yeah, I think so. Like we said at the beginning, right? It's to love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind, and to love each other, and it's for God's glory. So, it's nice to have that. Like the foundations of. I was talking to my wife actually about this. How awesome it is as a believer to never have doubted where I stand in this world. I've never thought about my individuality, my purpose in life. I've never had to question those things because of my assurance in my faith and because of my my relationship with the Lord. I've always had a great ground to stand on, and that's something that drops from beneath you when you if you dive deep enough, it drops beneath you when you leave God. And unless you create your own sort of like imaginary sort of solution, but then you just gotta admit that it's imaginary. So So anyway, look, that's sort of the emotional intellectual problem. The Bible has plenty to say about this, which is awesome, as we were just saying. Like, it gives us that sort of foundation. So like, is it a surprise to us that there's suffering in this world as a believer? Like, no, right? Like, we're taught this week in, week out, day in, day out. Every single day you read the Bible, it's just fused, like, absolutely full of suffering. From Genesis all the way through to Revelation, it's just nothing but suffering. And we have these epic examples all throughout Scripture. Obviously, Job is like the forefront, right? Like, he's that sort of pedestal of suffering, and God really used them as an example, and has probably made him the biggest example. I would say arguably the biggest example of suffering in the entire world in human history. He's become like that sort of forefront.
Apart from Jesus, probably.
Apart from Jesus. That's a good point. Apart from Jesus, which is actually another one. Another one of the points is Jesus. Jesus suffering, but man. So that's kind of where I go with the emotional, intellectual problem. The other thing that's worth mentioning is, does the Bible say that we're promised happiness? And that becomes another question, is like, why are we talking about suffering in the way that we're talking about suffering? Is oftentimes because people think that you're supposed to be happy in this life, and if I'm not happy, then there's something wrong with the structure of reality, with the universe, and that's kind of becomes their main goal in life, is happiness. But the Bible doesn't teach that. The Bible actually
it does not.
It doesn't promise happiness. It actually doesn't even promise you tomorrow. Like, it's quite upfront about all these sort of things. So, God forbid, I might not even make it home today. I don't even know what's going to happen in the next 10 seconds. God, like, let alone tomorrow. So for us to speak on a topic like this as though it's an intellectual problem just falls apart straight away. And that the Bible says, do not boast about tomorrow. And
it says, don't worry about yesterday. Don't think about tomorrow.
That's right. Yeah, I guess that's a good point. I like, actually, what it does is it flips it, right? It's not only doesn't promise you happiness, but it actually promises you suffering, right? So like Jesus in John 15, he says that I think it's if you the world, what does it say? It's something like if the world hates you, know that it hated me first. That's paraphrasing, but if the world hates you, then know that it hated me first. And then straight in the next chapter, it literally says that that we're going to have tribulation, right? Like, it's his promise. The first one is like, life's going to suck, and just know that it sucked for me too, in that sort of suffering sense anyway. By the way, the promise is that you will face tribulation, and it's going to be especially in my name, if you walk in accordance with, God's calling for you. It's as a believer, it really promises you there can be opposite. So it's not a surprise to us. This sort of suffering.
I think, I think everyone will have to deal with suffering, but what the Bible promises us is that we're going to go through suffering, but then it also gives we can have joy in suffering. We can actually thrive in suffering. We can do all this stuff. But with, I think, a godless life, there is no joy in suffering. There is no peace in suffering. There's no meaning in it. Right?
It's completely, it's just pain. Utterly meaningless pain and hurt. And like, there's I've heard it put this way, where you have a believer standing at the side of the deathbed of a child, and he holds the child's hand and says, "You will be with the Lord, and don't worry, you will be at peace one day, and there'll be no tears, there'll be no crying." And he comforts the child, and then walks out, and the atheist walks in and holds a hand on the child and says, "Sorry, mate, that's the way the cookie crumbles." It's like, one person suffers, the other doesn't, and that's just the way life is. And you're going to close your eyes and it's going to be blackness. And that's the alternative if you want to face it at what it really is. But as a Christian, we anticipate these things, right? Like we know about these things, and we have. Well, I know that we're not promised happiness, we're not promised tomorrow, we're not promised these things, but we do have a whole stream of promises in Scripture, and that's what gets us through life as it is. And so you have, the promises of peace. You have promises of a clear mind, of meaning, of comfort, the Holy Spirit, discernment, wisdom, eternal life, community in the church. Like these are the promises that we cling to as believers.
Fun fact is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's over 7,000 promises that God makes us in His Word.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
It's epic. Yeah. It's so like those are things as believers we cling to, not happiness, not these sort of futile things that come and go. No, it's great if happiness visits you.
Happiness, like it's just an emotion. Like you're gonna be sad, you're gonna be happy, you're gonna be all this stuff.
Yeah. And if it visits you happy, like take a moment, give thanks to God, and enjoy the happiness that stumbles upon you in that moment, and then as it goes, know that you have the foundation in the Lord, and you cling to those promises again, and it's amazing. It's something I cannot deny, the peace that I have in the Lord. And I'm sure you can say the same thing. It's really it really is something, and it's something you just got to experience. So that's the first that's where I usually start. Is now we're doing this in like a podcast sort of format, just kind of discussing it amongst brothers in the faith. But if you're talking to someone who's really struggling with it, your approach would be more so like, look, is this an emotional problem or is it an intellectual problem? And then you can have that free sort of conversation. The next one I think that you hear the most. So point number one is it emotional or intellectual? The second point that I just go to, that's a helpful thought for me that exercises my mind in the right direction, is just the topic of free will. That's usually where people kind of go to, like, we live in a world and we're free agents, and I have the freedom, with this right hand, I can reach into my pocket and hand you $50. And with the same right hand, I can clench it into a fist and I can punch you in the face. And God didn't do either. And for us to try to claim that God made me punch Jonah in the face is, you can see how ludicrous it comes across, right? So, so the free will thing is, we, obviously we've been born into this world, and we make free choices. We choose evil each and every day. When the Twin Towers occurred, we don't shake our fist at God and say, "How could you have flown those?" People freely chose to climb into that plane, and with that agenda in mind, and with that falsehood as a motivation, flew planes into buildings. Now, I mean, there's plenty of conspiracy theories and whatever else. We don't need to go there. Someone's going to say something somewhere, but you get my point, right? Like you don't shake your fist at God and say, "God made me." That's a big mistake.
It's funnily enough, if you if you look at a lot of the messed up things that people do, they actually blame. They don't blame, but you can tell like it's actually the devil that is at hand, not God.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's like what are the enemies of the faith, right? You have the devil, you have the world, and you have the flesh, right? And so now all three of those things can be at play at one time, and all sorts of things are occurring all throughout this world. We know that it's a corrupt, suffering world. That's what we've been born into, but that's not the end of the story. That's the awesome thing about the faith, right? And the best part is we have the end of the story. We know the beginning and we know the end, right? So it's very comforting. Yeah, for sure. There's a mad quote actually from JP, and I know people are going to get upset about good old JP. Everyone in the chat knows JP. He says, everything horrible that human beings have done was done by human beings, and you are one of them. Yeah. It's a good thought to put yourself in that perspective. This is what we're actually capable of, and you don't want to try to convince yourself that I'm good and everyone else is. You get the point. You get the point. So that's why free will becomes important, because it's not exhaustive, because your dad with, let's say, God forbid, dad cancer. That has nothing to do with free will. Yeah. It's a whole nother stream of suffering. Sure. But it does help you put things into perspective with respect to the evil and the evil in this world. So it chooses one.
I think that's aspect. That would be the approach for a question like, why does bad things happen to good people, sort of thing? Because we believe that no one is good. Even Jesus himself, no one is good except for the Father. But But people would say like they're good, but we know that if you have sinned, you're technically not good.
Yeah, well,
People don't understand.
and it's not only that you've sinned that time. We do nothing but sin all the time, every day.
Yeah,
and that's something that I think one of the most useful tools of when you come to the faith. This was the most eye-opening thing for me personally when I started to dig deeper into the word. Is like, holy cow, I'm so selfish.
Yeah.
I all my thoughts are about. Like I give myself the illusion that I'm doing this for the other person when really it's for me.
Yeah.
And you start to really kind of do some weird psychological dive in your own mind to see I am rotten inside.
Well, that's what
So,
I mean. The Bible literally says that about the Bible. It says it's double-edged sword. It's like going to a mirror as well and seeing your reflection.
Yeah.
It's a lot of different things.
That's right.
And like, yeah, it's powerful. It's double-edged sword because it will hurt you, but you can also use it to like better yourself and to be stronger anyway. So yeah,
like we're not going to, let's say a person is not condemned and taken away from the presence of God for all eternity because of Adam and Eve's sins. You're going there because of your sins. Like it's And just to clarify as well, the free will thing can oftentimes be used kind of as a way to take the responsibility off God. And I think we can both say we're not doing that here at all. The responsibility is it's not that we're trying to we say, oh, it's humans are causing the evil in this world. And so see, look, I can take it off. That's not the intention. God actually steps in repeatedly through our scripture, and he's sovereign over all things. And that's where that's where you have to come to the understanding that there is purpose in all things. And it's a really cool thing that I've been diving into more and more lately. That hopefully you and I can touch on that as a really good example of this. So, from there, oftentimes like it got me thinking. This is not something I would do in conversation. It's just a really cool thought. Could God have created a world with no suffering? Well, yeah, he could have. He could have created a whole bunch of people who are perfect all the time and do no sin at all, and he very well could have. He's an, as we say, an omnipotent God, so he could have done that.
Would you say that he actually did? But it wasn't like he did that initially, but he also put in free will.
Yeah. That's bang on. Like that's exactly what's happened, right? He repeatedly throughout Genesis, it was good, it was good, it was good, it was very good with mankind, and so things were created perfectly and in peace and in unity. And then the free choice of Adam and Eve. In fact, he only gave them one main command, right? And even with that, with two people, we had the population of 2. So you imagine now we've got billions, right? Population of 2, you got one command, and there was 1 ounce of temptation brought to them with the serpent, and they fell. And that's the whole point, is that yes, God could have created a fully populated planet with perfect beings that do nothing and choose nothing but good, but then you have a world of robots. And so if that's what God wanted, he could have done that, but clearly that's not what he wanted, and it's not what he intended.
That's so out of God's character, and the more you understand God's character,
that's right. So one of the purposes we know of life is to have that free, loving relationship with our Creator, and you can't have love without free will, and that's why free will is so important. Now I know, again, theologically speaking, there's gonna be people with all sorts of different opinions about free will, and they dance around the term and how they use it and all that sort of stuff, and that's fine. But ultimately, you get the point. It's that God could have created a planet of robots. He's chosen not to. He's given us that free will. There's almost kind of like that step back that is taken to let our minds unfold and our actions take place. And he by all means he interjects and supports and comforts and guides and provides wisdom and all that sort of thing. But ultimately, if there is no free will, there is no love. That's kind of the point we're driving home. There's a really cool, I don't know if you know Alvin Plantinga. He's a really cool, great philosopher. And I'm just paraphrasing him here. I've written down something that I thought was really powerful. He says, a world containing creatures who are significantly free and free to do more good than evil actions is more valuable, all things considered, than a world with no free creatures at all. Now, God can create free creatures, but can't cause or determine them to only do what is right. For if he does, then they aren't truly free. They aren't doing what is right freely. Therefore, he must create creatures capable of doing evil. And he can't give those creatures freedom to perform evil and at the same time prevent them from doing so. Otherwise, again, they aren't truly free. And sadly, God's creation chose their evil. That for me brought it home. I was like, that's a great way to just sum all that up. Is for me that sort of point number 2 of free will is God has chosen to create us free, and the world around us is a consequence. But with great evil comes great good.
Yeah. I have this is like a devil's advocate question. But I understand what you're saying, and I'm just going to play it again.
Yeah, go for it.
But isn't it just like, didn't God set us up for disaster in the first place by placing that tree and saying like, Adam and Eve, don't eat from it? But we know that there's been billions and billions of people, so wouldn't it just inevitably someone eat from that tree eventually?
Yeah, well, to me, I think the placement of the tree and the way it's described in Genesis is the choice. That is God presenting the choice. That is, here's the whole garden is yours. You have authority, and he gives them responsibility within. And Adam names the animals and does that shit. Like God, it describes it as God walking with them. And in and amongst all that glory, he presents them with the choice. That's how I see it. That's kind of the message it's trying to bring home, is that mankind made in God's image, one of those elements is rational mind, right? The free choice is presented with that choice in the garden. And despite it being the one temptation and the one choice amongst the perfect garden, man still chooses evil.
Yeah.
And so, God could have created it where there was a placement whereby no evil could have possibly been made, but then you fall back into the problem of, okay, well, you've just created a place of more or less of robots. Yeah. And then when you start looking at the angels, same sort of situation, right? They didn't have the serpent or the tree or anything like that, but the pride of the mind of the angels and Lucifer in particular, he said, I'm going to be above God. And that's kind of how we understand the fall of Satan to be, in and around the problem of pride and arrogance and that Luciferian intellect, right? So no matter what, I think the point is that if free will is presented before you, there will be an evil action or choice.
So you're saying the tree was just the option of free will, sort of.
Yeah.
Without the tree, there would be no free will.
It's not that without the tree, it could have been anything, right?
Yeah.
Like we said about the angels, there was no tree, but there still was the evil.
I get you. Yeah.
But I think it was just more like the representation of the knowledge of good and evil, that sort of that choice to go against God. And that's why the sin actually ended up, it was disobedience, right? It was, here's the choice. Are you going to obey or are you going to disobey? And then they fell into the lie, into the trap. So I don't think, it didn't have to be a tree specifically. It's just so happened to be chosen that way. That's how my view of it. And that actually goes straight into the next point, actually, which was, we were talking about this already, the feasibility of the world, of that God could have created. So the way that I phrase, and this goes back again to William Lane Craig, he talks about, is it even feasibly possible for a world to exist with creatures endowed with free will without evil and suffering? And we've already kind of touched on this, so we don't have to do any sort of crazy deep dive, but you can see that it's logically possible to have a world where everybody exists and only chooses good. Like logically, you can kind of think of that, but is that actually a feasible option? That's kind of the question that this is trying to raise, yeah? And I think you and I pretty much have answered that question. I don't think it is feasible. Yeah. Really, truly, if a person has libertarian free will, and I put into the world that there won't be some sort
my
of
phone on silent.
That's all good.
It's usually it's always on silent, but for some reason
it's not. That's all good. Yeah. So like, how do we know that the world such as ours, with creatures endowed with free will, with a purpose of coming to know the Lord and coming into a love relationship with God, wouldn't be simply suffused with suffering? So that's what you and I were touching on before. And like it's fascinating as well, because, and again, we've actually already talked about this, but he could have created a world with a population of 5. He could have created a world with a population of 100, of 1,000. He could have done it in whatever way God pleases. In his omnipotence, he could have done whatever he pleases. The funny thing is, we have an example of 2, a world populated with 2, and evil still erupts. So so I don't think it's a question of, is it logically possible? I think it's a question of, is it feasible for God? Because he's chosen to create this world with free creatures, so we can come into a loving relationship with him. So that's kind of like the third point that I was doing some really like deep diving into. I was like, it's great. These are just great thought exercises, right? The fourth one that I touch on, this one I find super interesting, and I hope you did too. But for me, this is awesome. I learned it back in physics when I was doing it at uni. You learn a little bit about something called chaos theory. Have you heard of chaos theory?
Oh, I've heard of it, but I'm not exactly sure.
It is awesome, man. It's really, really cool. It's also known as the butterfly effect. Have you heard of the butterfly effect? That's something that's also kind of referring to the same thing. So it's people hear this and they kind of go down different avenues. I'll just tell you where my mind kind of takes me when I go into this. It came from a bloke, I should say that the term butterfly effect became popularized by a gentleman named Edward Lorenz. He was a mathematician and a meteorologist, and he coined that term. He first stumbled upon it when he was doing mathematical models for kind of like forecasting the weather. And what he would do is he would plug in the numbers, and he would run the data, and he would print out the results, and he'd get different forecasts based on different mathematical models.
Yeah.
And his system, the model he was utilizing, ran to 6 decimal places, and he would get a forecast of the weather. And he would do another one and he'd get a forecast. And on one occasion, he rounded to 3 decimal places instead of 6. Like, just to get that into perspective, 6 decimal places are 0.13. Whatever. That's already ridiculous, right? All he did was reduce it by 3 decimal places, and he ran it through the model, and the entire forecast was radically different. I'm not talking like it was slightly more cloudy or whatever it is that you might end up pulling through with the model that he's trying to produce. It was completely different. Completely. And so what he found from this was, holy cow, this is how significant the initial conditions matter for any sort of system or model or anything that you run, to the extent that just 3 decimal places presents a completely different effect. And so where he kind of took that down to was to present, his example was the fluttering of the butterfly's wings in Brazil could potentially cause a tornado in, I don't know, like Toronto or something like that in America. He uses. So his whole point is like, everything matters. And and this is not like a fluffy Hollywood phrase. This is literally and physically speaking, in physics, absolutely everything matters, even to the extent of a flutter of a butterfly's wings. So now that when I heard that the first time and I started to do a bit more diving, I was like, wow, this is ridiculous.
Right? It sounds so like...
It's so bizarre. It sounds like I'm exaggerating.
Yeah.
I'm really not exaggerating. Like, everything genuinely matters in the physical world, even to that extent. That's what's so powerful about this. And now, like I said, some people kind of take that to, they focus on the initial conditions, or they focus on this aspect. For me, what that kind of did for me was, is it emphasized just how significant everything really is. Everything matters. And not everything matters just in a religious sense, not just in our faith. We know that everything matters because we have meaning in life, and that's quite clear for us. But everything matters from a physical perspective. In physics, everything literally matters. And so that goes from the biggest events like a car accident, and that goes to the smallest events like me stubbing my toe as I'm walking into this room, Like, you're thinking of something and you're on your way to somewhere and you stub your toe, and your attention is drawn away for that moment as you're focusing on the pain, and you're hopefully not swearing, but you're saying something that's, trying to emote the pain that you're going through. And then you're brought back to your mind, and it's slightly different from the train of thought that you're on previously. You stubbed your toe, that matters. Like, and the amazing thing is, it's not only that every single aspect of every single thing matters. It's God knows every single aspect of every single thing that occurs, and He knows every single ripple effect that occurs, the butterfly effect of literally everything in this universe. And when you grasp that like, God knew the outcome of me stubbing the toe, and that has been providentially injected into the fabric of reality, so that the outcome of that is going to be fruitful and meaningful. That's where it becomes that's where like it hit me. I was like, holy cow. Have you watched the movie Sliding Doors? It's used quite often as, okay, it's an old movie, so I'm not surprised. It's pretty sketch looking, but it's got a cool little, the whole gist of the movie is lady's running down to the subway. As she's running down, she kind of like stumbles on some kid's toy who's playing on the stairs, and she's like, stumbles over the toy and runs over for the train and misses the sliding doors close, and she misses the train. And then it shows you the alternatively, the father, who was distracted previously, now picks up the daughter with the child and takes her just slightly away from that step. She doesn't stumble on that step. She makes the train. And then the movie splits from there. It goes into two avenues. One where she's caught that train, and one where she hasn't caught that train. And one of them, it just one effect after another, after another leads to she's some successful businesswoman, and something else happens, whatever else. The other one, her life is like falling apart, and she's having love issues and all sorts of different things. And it just is a great highlight to say, like,
everything matters.
Everything seriously matters. Really matters. So now what that also does is, like, it gets the hairs on my arm standing up, but it also shows you like just how intricate this world is, and just how pathetic we are. Really, like we were saying earlier, right? I don't even know what's going to happen 10 seconds from now, let alone tomorrow. And yet we have the audacity in this intricate, insane world where all these things are fragmenting off into all sorts of different repercussions, and everything mattering to that extent, and God knows that extent. And I have the audacity to shake my fist at God and go, why did you let me fail that test or something? You know what I mean? Like So that's kind of what it does for me. But
whenever I know it's a bit different, but like whenever I look into like even just like a bit of science or like whatever it is, and you go like deep, like even if you look at space, I don't know if everyone's seen the Indescribable by Louis
Yes,
Higley.
I was gonna say the same thing. Awesome stuff.
Yeah, it's just like you go to like the depths and you just see like, okay, like there has to be a creator.
Yeah, and you're this speck in this floating place called space. Yeah. And on this tiny speck, which is not even visible to the eye, there's Joel shaking his fist at the creator who's just created the entire cosmos with his words, saying, how could you allow this to happen? And we've got no, like, and it's not even the other thing that I get frustrated with, and maybe I shouldn't, but I just, after I've been like delving into this, I get frustrated myself. I'll like, something will happen in my life. Let's say, for example, it could be a good thing. Like the light goes red and I stop at the light, and then there's an accident. And I go, that's why, God, thank you, God. He made that light red for me so that I don't get into that accident. And I kind of make it about myself, and I give it its purpose, and I proclaim it, and I go, that's why that's happened. Or like people like to talk about COVID in that sort of way and all sorts of different things. And they make a statement and go, that's why that's happened to you. Job's friends were awesome at this, right? Yeah. This is why this has happened to you, because of this, and that. And they give their pathetic 3-pound brain explanation, when really, like, what does the Bible say? The hairs on your head are numbered. Like, God has taken everything into account, even to the extent that you've stubbed your toe. God's taken that into account. Yeah. So I try, what this has taught me to do is to refrain from proclaiming a purpose to something that occurs in my life, because what do I know? Yeah, absolutely. And it's not even my own life, because I like to make things about myself. This is what humans are great at doing. What about 100 years from now? What about 200 years from now? Like, if meeting my wife, just meeting my wife, what's that doing in 1,000 years from now? Like, this is a zooming out that it does for me. It's really, it's very, very powerful. Yeah.
Even when I just look at like humans, and not even look at like the massive picture, but you just look at humans and you just like, all right, there are probably 8 billion people on Earth right now, depending who you are. But I believe that Earth has only been around for 6 to 8 years, whatever it is. So let's say there's been like 50 billion people probably more, I don't know, to ever live. And not one of those people are the same. Like, not even just physically. Yeah. No one's the same physically. No one's the same mentally. Like, no one is exactly the same. And that is crazy. Like, I couldn't even think of like 100 different possibilities. You know what I mean?
That's right.
Like, it's just, like, God is so, he's all knowing. His knowledge has no limits, and his creativity has no limits. Where every single person is different, and it's drastically different as well. It's not even like
100%. Like, he's taken all that. Like, there's plenty of examples in the Bible where God uses sort of like the evil of man to bring about good. Like, Joseph is probably the cleanest example of that, where what does it say? What you intended for evil, God intended for good. And that is quite literally what God is doing through and through, all across the universe in ways that we just cannot fathom.
Yeah.
And it's for that reason that it should humble you. That should take at least an element of your arrogance down, because we like to rationalize things, and that's what humans are best at. But man, like
some things that just
there's something to that you've got to take seriously.
Yeah, for sure.
Have you heard there's a epic story, like I think it's like a proverb, a Chinese proverb of the farmer and his horse. It's cool. It's just like a really quick story. It's something like there was a widowed farmer and he's there with his son. So it's just him and his son out in a farm. And I think the horse, so the farmer there with his son. The son accidentally leaves the gate open and the horse escapes the farm. Neighbors come along and they go, "Oh, how unfortunate! Your horse is now gone and you're left alone. That's very, very unfortunate." And the farmer responds, "Maybe." And then the horse comes back with 7 other wild horses. And the villagers or the neighbors all come and they go, "Wow, what good fortune. You've got 8 horses now and it's all brought about from this event that occurred. How fortunate." And he says, "Maybe." And then one day the son is out there with the horses, and while he's caring for the many horses that they now have, one of the horses comes and falls on the kid and breaks his leg. And it's horrific. And the neighbors all come and they come, "Oh, how unfortunate. If you hadn't got those extra horses, look at the kid now, he's broken his leg. It's very unfortunate." And the farmer responds, "Maybe." And then there's an army, what is it? They're coming through for a recall to join the military. It's something like that, looking for the fit young men, And they go to the house and they see the son there with his broken leg and they go, "Okay, we can't take your son because he's obviously injured." And they pass by. Neighbors all come again. "How fortunate that's happened to you." And it's maybe. So the whole point of it is like, it's so easy to just make a proclamation, assert something about life. So I like that sort of
that's cool
imagery.
Never really thought about that actually. That's man.
Mm-hmm. So that's kind of like, for me, what was that? The third point, I think it was the butterfly. The fourth point, the butterfly effect, chaos theory. That for me is like a very sort of powerful tool for just on this topic, is just to show, just to zoom out a bit, like just take things into perspective. That's kind of what it does for me.
I can tell like these conversations go on for like forever.
Yeah.
And I'm really enjoying it. I would say probably another 20 minutes.
Yeah, perfect, man.
We've been going for like an hour and 10 minutes already.
Oh, seriously?
Yeah.
An hour and 10 minutes? Holy cow, man. Okay, well, we'll wrap this up. If that's the case,
I usually aim for an hour 30 minutes anyway. So
cool. Okay, all right, cool. All right.
If we go over, it's fine, I guess.
All right, no. Well, look, that's what I mean. Like at the beginning of this, we said we could literally spend days on just one of these topics. Like the topic of free will, and there's a lot more in and around suffering. There's a lot to take into consideration, and it's got to be taken seriously. So that's why I like to kind of jot this stuff down. But yeah, that whole item on the butterfly effect and chaos theory is. Have you heard the series, The 3-Body Problem? Have you watched that? Yeah, no. 3-Body Problem. No. Oh man, okay. It's a very popular series that's going on right now. It's actually pretty good. You should watch it. It's interesting. Okay. I was going to say that's an example of chaos theory, but that's all right.
I haven't seen it. Yeah. I'm out of touch.
No, that's all good. That's good. There's a guy who says I love these sort of illustrations, so I'm sorry I'm saying a lot of them, but I find them very, very, it's good to just give you perspective. There's a bloke, Bishop Barron, who a lot of people are going to judge me for because, that's just what people like doing, but he's got some great insight, and he gives a really good illustration as well about and this is just something that we do habitually, is we look at a very specific instance, because this is how this topic comes up in most cases. We'd be in a conversation, they'd bring up the example, "This happened to me, explain it to me." And one way that he puts it is, are you a fan of Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter? Okay, I was going to use Harry Potter. Okay, Lord of the Rings.
Both is.
All right, let's take Lord of the Rings. You have a whole volume of books. Right? And then you take one of those books and then the book is opened and a page is torn and it's flying out into the wind and it carries on through and it gets fragmented along the way and it falls upon the dust of the ground, and someone comes along and picks up the page, a fragment of a page, and then they read just maybe a sentence, and it could be something good, something glorious, something awesome, or it could be something horrific, like, you know, Frodo and the disaster of him trying to get to Mordor and whatever else, you know, like it's this horrible thing that's occurring. And then they read that and they go, what a horrible thing to happen. Like whoever wrote this, like must be twisted. There's something wrong. Like this is so bad. I can't believe this sentence that I read. And this is what we do, man. Like we pick up this fragment and we have this experience and we go, how could God have allowed that to happen? How could the writer have, that's horrific. But then you got to take that this sentence falls part of a paragraph, which falls part of a page, which falls part of a chapter, which falls part of a book, which is in and amongst a volume of books. And here we are in this speck of dust in this slither of time and space. And we look at this instance, this thing that has occurred to us, and we go, how could God have allowed that? So that for me, that helps me kind of these sort of illustrations. I mean, we haven't got too much time, but I'll just go into maybe one or two more points, and I suppose one of them is another helpful tool. This is more psychological now. So we've touched on kind of like a philosophical point, a theological point, another philosophical point, and a scientific point on the butterfly effect. This is more kind of like psychological sort of insight, which I find helpful. It's just differentiating between evil and malevolence and how human beings handle evil and malevolence versus tragedy. So there's tragedy and then there's evil and malevolence. And that sort of psychology, understanding how humans deal with those two things is quite interesting, because we know life is full of misery and suffering. For some people, it might be actually mostly suffering. And so in and amongst all that, there's a powerful counter question that can be raised here. And I've heard, again, JP of who's
by the way, if you don't know who JP is, John Piper.
Sure. Actually, there's two JPs. So,
you went, so Jordan Peterson.
So there's, so I'm very interested. No, I'm very interested in, so in here, I've like in these notes, I've got a lot to do with John Piper, a lot to do with John MacArthur, and a lot to do with Jordan Peterson, a lot to do with John Lennox, William Lane Craig. Like there's a whole bunch of different people. But actually, funnily enough, there's...
Who are you referring to? Because I was thinking
in that instance, I was talking Jordan Peterson for psychology.
I meant the first one.
The first one, what was the reference I made there? I think that was...
It sounded more
I think that was Jordan Peterson as well.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yeah, there's 2 points in here which are deeply theological, and that goes into like the meaning of life and the glory of God. Actually, there's 3, and then the suffering of Christ. And those ones is like, when you go into the great sermons of your John MacArthur's and whatnot, holy cow, there is a wealth in that, in and of itself. And again, we could just be hours on that alone. So, so
Jordan Peterson.
So this one's Jordan Peterson, and he puts it very, very nicely because obviously this is his specialty, right? He teaches at Harvard. He's a professor of psychology, not anymore, but that was his forte. And so he has a great kind of question. He says, what if you tried not to make it more miserable than it had to be, your life, right? Like, then what would it be like? And he says, I would suspect that a lot of the misery would go away. And this is where he starts to get interested in the psychology. It's the unnecessary misery that ends up bringing us down. It's, someone dying of cancer is horrible. It is horrible, and it's very hard to manage. But it's not like you can say, if only we did things differently, then this would not have occurred. You know what I mean? These are the tragedies of life. But when someone is out torturing you in malevolence, or if you're doing the same thing, and we do this all the time in amongst ourselves in our circles, that's a horrible add-on of life. So let me put it this way. If you aren't suffering from self-imposed selfishness and evil, then how good could you make life in the end? And could you could actually survive it. It's something that you could actually bear with. You could survive, and you could walk through. So it's good to put that into perspective. It's a tough pill to swallow as well, because when you start to think about what could I do with my own life and how could I do things differently, then the onus starts to fall on you, right? It's like, well, now it's my responsibility to try and do the best that I can with my life and the lives that are given to me as my responsibility.
Honestly, like I get what you're saying, and I agree. Like that's the trap that we can fall in. But if we have a clear mind, I think for me, I'll speak on my experience, and this is recent. Literally nothing really changed in life, but just my attitude. my attitude was really like negative, down.
Yeah, perspective.
And it just like the way I was I was angrier, I was more upset, like more whatever. But then it literally just made like it was one day where I was just like, what am I doing? And then I was like, I'm gonna be more like it was genuinely just like a 180 in change. And life since then has been like nothing really has changed externally or whatever, but life now is so calm and like I'm actually happy. And you can probably tell from like other people's perspectives and stuff, you can probably tell like Jonah's a bit different. What happened? Nothing happened.
It's a flip of perspective, and you've stopped in drenching your own life with needless suffering, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Self-inflicted, right? It becomes
But even like let's say something did happen. Let's say I got unwell, or like one of my family members got really sick, and whatever it is. Say something did happen. Obviously, I think it's more than okay to be upset and to like whatever, have questions and whatnot. But I think even in those moments, I mean, this is biblical, but there is also a time where you can feel joy in that. You can actually have a perspective like, oh, okay, like I think if this is going to be, it's so hard to do. It's much easier said than done. But if we just look at what God has already given us, or like our lives in general, I think that's why you see people in Africa that don't have anything. All the photos, they're just smiling. They're just like, they're happy.
That's one of the points, by the way. there's a lot more salvation in the countries of suffering than there is of a country like ours. So
yeah, I think this is sidetracked, but I think the more simple life is, the more understanding you
100%, man.
It's like the childlike faith and all that kind of stuff. It's just
we are very, very I don't know what a better word, spoiled for you know what I mean, like very entitled and privileged in the world that we live in today. And the unfortunate fact of the matter is, with suffering comes greater salvation and greater blessing and glory to God. And that's a fact of reality. That's not my opinion. If you literally just take the stats, it's significantly higher in countries that are suffering. And that's just a interesting little side point.
Again, that's another side point. Sorry. My theory on life, the two biggest killers is actually for the Western world, I would say, or just in life, is just I would say is comfort and shame. Shame's a bit separate, but two of those things are.
That's interesting. Shame, okay. That's
we'll get into it later.
Now I should make my own podcast. Okay, I'm curious. Actually, that's interesting. The shame, I didn't expect.
I think shame probably in a Christian world, maybe. I don't know. But like it's hard for me to resonate with someone that doesn't have that kind of sort of life. But for me, at least, shame was a big killer.
Right. Yeah. I think I know where you're going with that, and that's really interesting thought.
Yeah.
Like that beating voice. That's interesting.
Anyway, that's a whole different.
No, it's good. It's good. This is awesome. Like this is the whole point of it. Like, this is the whole topic of tragedy and evil, right? Like humans can face tragedy, as horrible as it is, and life can really suck at times, you know. But we're built to deal with tragedy. It's the evil and that sort of malice, those malice experiences that we go through, that really bring a person to their knees and destroy a person. And there's the example he gives actually is, you're at your father's deathbed. That's a tragedy. And then he says, you're at your father's deathbed. Here's another scenario. You're at your father's deathbed, and you and your idiot siblings are all arguing over the deathbed. That's evil. That's the unnecessary disaster that comes with our human nature, you know, and who we are as people. And maybe the first one, you will actually be able to build a stronger relationship with the family, and you overcome it together, and you support each other, and you build each other up in and amongst absolute tragedy. Like, it is really, really horrible what's happening, but we're built to be able to oppose that, and it can actually bring about a lot of good. But you see the other one, it's like hell. You know, what a horrible. And unfortunately, I've witnessed this myself. That sort of bickering and the pride, and it's a horrible place to be, man. So
sure.
So when we're faced with tragedy, I think that's something, and that's a good distinction to make just between them. the evil and tragedy.
Mm.
How much longer we got?
We can keep going.
Cool. All right. I won't keep referring to you. You call me out at any moment, and we'll.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Cool. All right. So that's the sort of the distinctions. That's like kind of like the fifth point that I would nice thought exercise. And again, it's just perspective, right? This is all just things to bring you into a good mind frame of understanding of how the world works, who your God is, and who you are.
Yeah.
So the sixth one that I found interesting was, which again, actually we've already touched on this, but without God, there is no such thing as good and evil to begin with anyway, right? So everything just becomes opinion and everything becomes relative. And so the question is always asked, like, what is the alternative? This is more like a philosophical and theological topic. And so as you and I touched on already, we were talking about how, take God out of the equation and all you have is relativity and opinion and that sort of stuff. So that's it's good actually, because you can confront them to say, like, you're saying that God is doing all these horrible things and all this evil in the world and the suffering, and like, how can you even say there's evil to begin with? That's a seriously good question to ask someone. Is that like, where are you getting that compass for what you're defining as evil? Maybe I want to steal from this person to benefit me and my family, for example. If I'm not caught, happy days. Like, and if it's all run by society, then you just got to look at history. You just got to look at the world around you, even today, to see what societies run as being good and as being evil. Yeah. And you tell me if you think that this is good, and you tell me that's evil. And all I'm going to get is your opinion at the end of the day. So even the very question of, or the very proposition that God is incompatible and is evil in this world and suffering, falls in and of itself. It's a self-refuting statement. So
it's interesting because, like, even within that, I think, like, we both believe that God has written morals on our hearts, or however we want to word it.
Yep.
And we are made in His image, and the way we love is because God loves us, all that kind of stuff. But I think even for well, I don't know what's happened to my voice. even for non-believers or whatever, you can see in their actions, the way they live, I think it's just misplaced. Because I think even if you look at sort of like the whole pride, LGBTQ, whatever, I don't know.
Yeah.
If you look at that, they're actually trying to love. They're trying to be loving and gracious and all that stuff. Or if you even just with this conversation, the emotional side of things is, why is there suffering that happens to people? It's because, like, they have a care for people. They have a love for people. I think it's just misplaced. And it's just, you can see, like, it's funny because we don't fully understand it, but they definitely don't understand it. It's like, that's God putting on your heart. You're just misplacing where it is. You're just not understanding.
Yeah, everyone's got that God-shaped hole in their heart, and everyone longs for that relationship and love, and that, people feel it with all sorts of different things. It can, whether it's religion or all sorts of different habits and things of that nature. But everybody has that, and our morals are written on our hearts. And as believers, the powerful thing is we have a grounding for that. We know where that comes from. It comes from God, and the goodness of God is represented in creation, in and amongst ourselves, and we have that capacity to do good and to love because we are made in His image. And we hold that value because we are valuable in His eyes. So and so I suppose, with the atheists, or with someone who doesn't want anything to do with God, it kind of appears they appear to give you an intellectual solution when they raise this at you, when really they're coming at you and the ground is falling from beneath their feet in the same breath. Oftentimes without them even realizing. And it's good to, sometimes it's helpful to go down that path with them, because it, like we were saying with the roaches, like that light, that blaring light, eventually they don't have many places to hide, and they can see, look, the problem is not my mind, the problem's my heart. That's where I think that's very confronting, but I think that's
it's funny because the Bible is very clear of, like, people hardening their hearts. And I think that's just with these conversations, that's the biggest problem, I guess. But if someone's heart is hard and there's not much you can do,
Yeah, man.
yeah,
Yeah,
you just gotta let God soften it, I guess.
Yeah, and that's why the command, even though it sounds like, oh man, I want to do more, the command is to pray for them, right? Because that is what ends up becoming the only thing you can do for those that want nothing to do with God. And you show them Christ, right? Like you live it and you pray for them. That's what we know to do.
Yeah.
The seventh one is understanding the purpose of creation. And again, funny enough, we've touched on this as well, that life is not about happiness. And we spoke about how we've got very clear instruction in the word. And for that reason, we have great direction and meaning and motivation. There's a cool thought exercise is, what would life be without trouble? Like, how much trouble would you want there to be, sort of thing. You don't want a life. It sounds kind of inviting and interesting to have a life with no suffering whatsoever. But if you really you think about it 15 minutes, you realize, okay, where there's a life with nothing to solve. You mentioned this, actually touching this about sort of like that spoiled child or that person that receives no discipline, whatever else. What becomes of you? What do you become? Who do you become, really? And so you want to have something to contend with. You want to kind of, like, maybe you could word it, you want to have problems that you can solve, that you can really solve.
Yeah, I mean, you see in like TV shows or movies, like people, you see character development when people go through something.
Yeah, there's that overcoming, right? There's that what's that? Is it the value in the pursuit? What's that word? The nobility in the pursuit, right? That's part of life, and it's something so essential to our very character and to being itself. There's one of the thoughts that I've been confronted with more across the past probably decade is the notion of kids, right? Like, if you look at psychologically, as far as I could see, when you look at moment to moment, people who do have kids versus people who don't have kids, moment to moment, you're gonna look at that and you're gonna see people who don't have kids are happier than those who do have kids. Now people will take that information and they draw some pretty crappy conclusions, and they go, therefore, because the purpose of life is happiness, we shouldn't have kids. Yeah. And that, like, they go down that horrible sort of a rabbit hole. But you got to wait a second. Like, maybe that's not the right way to think about it, right? That's maybe you're using the wrong metric. Maybe happiness isn't the goal. And what a crappy, like we were saying earlier, you and I, happiness comes and goes, right? If that's the goal, what do you do when you're? And this is why people are crumbling so much more these days. When in the unfortunately without God, is because happiness is the goal. When they are hit with tragedy, everything falls apart. Because that's the whole drive. That's their motivation. Yeah. It's happiness.
I think people chase happiness because that's their measurement of feeling good. When God has written on our hearts to actually find intimacy, to find love, to find all this stuff, and it's not just the happiness. There's moments in where God is frustrated, He's angry, He's upset, sometimes He's happy. Like we have all these emotions, and it's funny because we sort of we measure emotions against each other. Like there's a high, what's it called?
Like a hierarchy?
Yeah, hierarchy. Well, there's actually, like, there's not. Like, they're all equally good.
Yes.
Like if one of my family members passed away, it would be sort of manic for me to be happy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's what I suppose in Ephesians it says, "In your anger, do not sin."
Yeah,
right? Like, it's not condemning the emotions that we go through.
How you respond.
It's what you do and how you manage yourself. And there's going to be moments of sadness, and that's Ecclesiastes chapter 3, right? There's a time right? Like it's the whole. There's a time for to be happy. There's time to be sad. There's a time for mourning. There's a time for there's a time for war. There's a time for it's how you manage that sort of stuff. And like, look, I don't have kids, but I've witnessed this through and through, and you can see, like, of course you're going to be less worried if you don't have kids, right?
Less stressful.
Yeah, that's right. But if the point of having children was to be happy, like, you can see what's going on there. Like, you can see that the issue going on there, right? So it's
interesting. I didn't know that people, like, that's a stat that people use. People are less happy. But to me, that obviously I can't really say because I don't have kids.
It's a moment-to-moment extraction. I can give you some of those ones there. They've just done kind of moment-to-moment extractions where they'll do kind of like throughout the course of a period of time. In this moment, how are you feeling? In this moment, how are you feeling? And then there's a lot more, some like the roller coaster ride of those because you have more to worry about, right? Like it's no longer about yourself anymore, and you're not just having some traveling sesh with your partner anymore. It's like my whole life is now revolving. So that's why you've got to change your view of what life is about. That's where that comes in.
For sure.
So I think that's a really important sort of thing to bring into perspective is what's the meaning of life. And I think once you do that, you can, we're not God's pets that, we pull on the chain to say, make me happy sort of thing. And that's not how that's not our relationship with the Lord. I'll go into, maybe I can fit one more in, you reckon? Because this one I think is probably the most important. We've been talking about some scientific stuff and philosophical things and some theological things and a bit of like just interesting notes in psychology that I found interesting.
They're very interesting.
Great thought sort of things for myself.
And anyway. I think they're probably, I don't know what your last point is, but they're probably the most beneficial to non-believers or like,
I think so. It's given me like good perspective. But like we were saying earlier, it's not why I believe. I have my relationship with the Lord, and that stands completely independent of all these things that we're discussing. They're just great things to keep you in perspective, to help you understand reality as it actually is, and to keep you in check. We should be reminding ourselves of the truth of our relationship with the Lord and humble ourselves and keep things like that. So, this is point 8 of like 13, but this one I think is very, very important. And again, you've mentioned this before, so we've been dancing around these points the whole time. It's really good. It's Christ's suffering.
I was actually going to ask you to let's like end with the Jesus.
That's the most important thing, right? Like we don't worship a God who is distant from us. He came into this life and into this world with us, right? So, and this is where actually I think John Lennox is my favorite way of wording this stuff. He's great. If anyone is listening,
I have
look up.
Fadi. I don't know. You might know Fadi actually. I don't know. Maybe you don't. But he loves John Lennox.
He's so good, man. He's just this happy chappy kind of like great. He's a mathematician and he's a professor at Oxford. He teaches obviously mathematics there. But he's great. He's just a really good like. What I respect and love about him is actually his grace, the way he speaks. He will be in the face of someone who is just ridiculing and mocking, and he can be there with that salt, that mercy that God, that meekness that Jesus teaches. He really does carry that seriously. He's a great. He really loves the Lord. It seems so. But what he pretty much points out is that we know that God is not some sort of impersonal being. He's not some indifferent tyrant who kind of sits back and watches the suffering unfold. Rather, he's a God who actually enters into human history. And in the person of Jesus Christ. And what does he do? His entire way through his life, he suffers. And so we worship a suffering king, a suffering Lord. You think about the cross, like what happened on that cross. Christ bore the suffering of the world upon his shoulders. And that's something that we as believers can relate to. Like it says, I think it's in Hebrews where he says that he's a Lord who can sympathize with our sufferings. Like he went through what we went through, what we go through each and every day. Even though he was innocent, and he bore even with all the injustice that he lived through, he bore all that for us. And none of us can comprehend what he suffered as well. Our journey as a Christian is trying to dissect that, right? Is trying to understand really the depth and the volume of the love of God and the love that he shared and gave us. And it's something that flows through in our lives, and God willing, it should be flowing through from us into other people's lives. And we should have that sort of overflowing faith in that sense that people can look at us and say, there's something different about Jonah. So that to me is a really powerful point to make, is that in and amongst all these things that we can be discussing and interesting things about chaos theory and how intricate the world is and all this, when it really comes down to it, the God that we worship is a suffering Christ. It's so it means that he can actually bear that suffering with us, and that he can relate to us, and we can speak openly with him, and we can ask God why, and we can cry out to him, and he's there with us through it all.
Yeah, amazing. Funnily enough, I have a tattoo. I don't know if you knew this.
Oh no, I didn't.
So I have a tattoo, and I'll explain it. Maybe I'll show the camera.
This is. I'm really intrigued. This is cool.
I don't know if the camera. I've shown the camera before.
Okay, all right,
just for whoever hasn't seen.
Yeah, I haven't seen that.
There's a crown. There's a man. There's a their hands. They're supposed to be like servant. I couldn't really imagine.
Yeah.
Servant,
okay. I see where you're going with this. That is awesome, man.
Yeah. So my favorite chapter in the Bible is Philippians 2.
Yeah.
I think it just depicts sort of Jesus in very simplistically. I think. Yep. Where it talks about Jesus as king. While he was in heaven, he literally had everything. He's God, right? And he's God in heaven, and he has everything to just in his hands. But then he realized, okay, well, he didn't realize, I don't know. But he needed to come down to earth and become man for man. So he came from perfection, from all powerfulness, and then he limited himself to be a man. And then from being a man, he even limited himself even more, or humbled himself more to actually serve man.
Yeah, he didn't come down as a king. He came down to serve. Yeah, that's right.
There's a Mark 10:45, I think. He came to serve, not to be served. Yeah, something like that. Yeah. And then even more than that, we have the cross, which is the most humiliating, most traumatic, most like. We often think about the physical pain, and obviously the physical pain is just the worst. Yeah. But what's even deeper than, and I didn't really realize this until probably last year, but it was the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament God. There is no difference, but the difference is that God put his wrath somewhere in the New Testament, and that was on Jesus. So Jesus took all that wrath of God that we deserved, which is, in my opinion, is a lot worse than the physical side of things.
100%,
He experienced the spiritual, just the torment. I don't know, spiritual, just destruction,
gut-wrenching separation from the eternal Trinity that he existed in. You imagine the eternity past, that perfect triune relationship between the God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And having that separated and wrenched out in an expression of love for measly creatures like us. It's
crazy. Like the perfect God turned to a perfect man, to a perfect servant, to experience the worst and most physical, most spiritual, emotional, all these things for our sake is crazy. He literally, we say that hell is a place where God isn't. And that's why it's hell. Yeah, it's that separation. Yeah, the separation from God. And Jesus literally, he experienced that wrath that is hell for our sake, and he's just like, and all we have to do is just choose Christ, and start living for Christ.
It's been put as, I've heard it put like this, which I find it like the perfect way to sandwich everything together. Is describing Jesus as the archetype, right? And he really is. He's much more than that, but he also is the archetype in the fullest sense of that word. It's like the most extreme suffering story you could possibly describe, right? And it's been fulfilled in a place and in a time in history by our Creator of all things, of all people, for that to occur to. It's it's the greatest being has come down to this muddy place called Earth, was betrayed by his closest friends and those dearest to him, was spat on, downtrodden. He was innocent among all things. Not only was he innocent, but they let someone who wasn't innocent and was clearly not innocent free in his place. He experienced the worst kind of pain and suffering you can possibly, as you just described, not only physically but spiritually and mentally. and they knew he was innocent, and they were still killing him.
Yeah.
And not only was he innocent, but he was doing nothing but good, and he did nothing but love everyone. You know what I mean? Like it's just the extreme of extremes. This gospel that we cling to. So yeah,
you know what's like, what makes it you like the cherry on top of all of this is like, even if you're an atheist or whatever it is, I mean, history points to Jesus being real for sure. I think people probably struggle with the resurrection part.
Yeah,
but again, there's a lot of evidence for that as well.
Yeah,
you know that Jesus is real, and if you look at everything Jesus did, there was no flaws. I don't know if maybe you know more than me, but I don't think they can hold anything against Jesus.
No, there is nothing that people have tried to, like, for example, pin stories. Like, they'll take a story of Jesus and they'll say like, Jesus said in this story that he's not gonna join them to go to this place, and then a few verses later he ends up joining them, and then they go, oh look, see, Jesus alive. Like that's the best they can do. You know what I mean? Like, they're really, and if that's the best they can do, which theologically it's perfectly sound. It's very easy to explain.
Yeah.
But if that's what people have to do, even 2,000 years later, that's the best crack they can have at Jesus. You know what I mean? Like,
it's like, it's this might sound a bit weird, but the way I sort of put it is like, Jesus may have suffered the most, and like he took the wrath of God and he suffered a lot. But I think the way I look at it is like the Father takes all the abuse, and Jesus, obviously Jesus takes abuse. I'm not saying he doesn't, but like you can't really hold the candle to Jesus and be like, oh, look at all this darkness in him or whatever. Yeah. But people can look to the Father and say like, oh, he's letting suffering and all that stuff. But you can't look to Jesus and be like, he's doing this and he's doing this and you know what I mean?
That's right.
Like even emotionally or whatever, it's like, oh, he has all these morals that are correct. He's doing all these things that are correct. Or they'll just create narratives to be against him. But
that's exactly what ends up happening, man. Like there's I think it's C.S. Lewis who talks about how you got to take Jesus seriously, as you said. There's no doubt. There's no doubt that he existed as a person, and we've got the most records about him by far. Like they're not even comparable in terms of number of manuscripts and content that we have about him, and direct witness accounts and extra biblical sources like Josephus and all that sort of stuff. There's no doubt he existed and that he lived the way that he lived, based on all the accounts that we have, and it's thousands. So you really need to address Jesus. That's what you have to do. Yeah. Who is Jesus? And he gives a few options, and I think this is exhaustive in my opinion. He says that he's either going to be a lunatic, or he's going to be a liar, or he's going to be Lord. Yeah. That's the three options they give, and I think that's the best. You have to confront that. Absolutely. No matter, and you can claim to be agnostic or whatever you want to say, but you need to have an answer for that. And if you think he's a lunatic, I mean, we don't need to go into it, but I've never read or seen any more sound teaching and love and power in Christ, and that just gets wiped out. If you think he was lying, like he suffered and died. Not only did he suffer and die, but you think the disciples are all doing what they're doing for a lie? Like, I think the only disciple who wasn't mutilated in the most horrific way for what they claim to have seen, not what they believed. Yeah. We saw the Lord risen from the dead, and I'm willing to die for what I have seen. I think every single one of them were completely mutilated in horrific ways. Peter hung upside down, one beheaded, another one dragged around by a carriage until he died. The only one I think was John, and he was banished to the like. You think back historically, like, man, this is not some power play to get the opiate of the masses and things like that. That doesn't stand. If you just do a little bit of research in history, you see that it's the power of what Christ brought to a people longer who are being freed from their sins.
I think you started off with it, but I think it has to be an emotional issue. Like intellectual, I think on a surface level, sure, you can have that, like from what you've been told, like God's not real, Jesus, whatever. But if you even dig like 1 centimeter in, you can see like, okay, that makes sense. So it has to be, your heart is hardened. You're not willing to be open to it, and it's just, you're emotionally like whatever it is.
And we've just brushed the surface, like you and I. You know, like
You've only
I
went through half
tried.
your
I tried when you told me, hey, look, let's chat, and we were talking about a few things, whatever else. I tried to jot down like a few kind of minor things based on these points, and we only got through like 8 out of 13.
Yeah.
But like you can see that if you just take a bit of time and effort to read a bit and understand yourself a bit more and do a bit of reflection, and I think it does become clear that, okay, look, this is, I think, a problem with my heart, not my mind. And the thing that I've always encouraged everyone, especially for people who are listening who don't know the Lord or are kind of on that edge or are struggling with that sort of thing, my honest opinion, because of how it's completely flipped my life upside down, and my family are there to confirm that, how my life has turned completely upside down, is to kneel down and ask the Lord. Like we take those sort of cliche words a little bit, or we make it into a cliche when we hear, seek and you shall find, ask and it shall be given to you, knock and the door will be open to you. But really, truly, so genuinely, true, if you fall down on your knees and you cry out to the Lord, the only promise I can make is that you will not be left without an answer.
Yeah.
And I can say that out of not only theologically but experientially. So
yeah, I think you just need to do it genuinely, because I think
people
be
say, sincere.
I asked, I seeked, and you're just like, really, did you?
Yeah, and that's where, unfortunately, when you're talking on the sort of subjective plane, it's really hard, because you can't, you don't want to accuse anyone of anything. You just state the facts. This is how it is, and they've got to be honest with themselves.
Yeah, for sure.
They're the ones that's got to come to God and say, okay, look, was I really where was I when I said that? Where was I in my mind and my heart? And I think that's something that I just can't deny, that if you ask, if you seek, if you knock, then the Lord will be there, and I can say that without a shadow of doubt.
Yeah, for sure. I think we will end here, but I just want to ask you, maybe for like a 30-second, maybe a minute overview. If I were to ask you, and you have 30 seconds to a minute to answer, why does God allow suffering? I know we just went
but that's a really good look, for me, I would say that God has created us free. He's created free beings who have a free choice. And like we were saying before, with my right hand, I can reach into my pocket and give you $50, and with that same right hand, I can strike you. And none of those can be blamed on God. And I think that accounts for a significant amount of evil in this world, is our free choices. And I would also say that life is an extremely intricate web of very complex decisions and instances and things that occur in this world that we just cannot possibly wrap our heads around. And I truly believe that God has morally sufficient reasons for the evil that occurs in this world. And I think those two combined would be my 30-second to 1 minute snippet response.
I love it. I love the answer, and I low-key did it for the real, so it's the edit afterwards.
Okay, so
works perfectly.
No, that's good. Awesome, man. Awesome.
But yeah, that's amazing. If there's anything else that you want to say, we can keep going, but happy to end.
That's it, man.
We'll get you on another time.
Yeah, man. No, it's good. It's good. Like, we could, if you said, hey, man, what about the Trinity? Like, boom, there's 3 days.
3 days.
Yeah. So like, it's not easy to compress these things. But I think it's a good chat.
I think it was good.
I'm grateful that you welcomed me.
No, anytime. Well, yeah, thank you for coming on. I hope to see you again. I hope they would want to see you again as well.
Sounds good, man.
But yeah, appreciate it. And thank you all for watching. And I'll see you guys next week. And I'll see you whenever.
Sounds good,
all
man.
Right,
Sounds good. Thanks very much, everyone.